The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord.
As Ria mentioned, today is the feast of the baptism of Jesus, so I've chosen just a very, very short reading from Mark's Gospel. Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. And just as he came up out of the water, he saw the skies torn open, and the Spirit came down upon him in the form of a dove. Then a voice from the heaven said, "You are my dear Son, in whom I delight." The Gospel inspired by God.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
When I came to the States in 1987, I was working with the Catholic Diocese of San Jose for about 8 years. And for the first 5 years, I was stationed just down the road here on Channing Avenue in St. Albert the Great Church. And then in 1992, I got transferred down to St. Aloysius, which is on El Camino. It's now been sold to the Ananda community. So when I went in there, had been an old priest living there who left some of his library after him. And most of it were theological tomes written in Latin. But there was one little booklet that I retrieved and I kept, and I still have it actually. And it is a copy of the Baltimore Catechism. I still have it.
I do, yeah.
You still got a copy, George? So I don't know how many of you remember the Baltimore Catechism, but okay, you know, God love you. So I would peruse it from time to time for the grins of it. So I remember at one stage reading this section on baptism, and it had a lot of things to say about baptism. And one of the things it said about baptism is that baptism ideally is performed by a priest. But if there's no priest available and the child is in danger, then a layman can do the baptism. And in actual fact, if somebody is dying at the side of the road and there's no Catholic person present to baptize him, anybody can baptize him. Even a Muslim can come across and baptize this person, as long as he does it according to the mind of the Catholic Church. Now, how your typical Muslim finding somebody to the side of the road can put on the mindset of the Roman Catholic Church and baptize the person according to that mindset, I don't know, but that was the rule. So anybody, even a non-Christian, could baptize somebody in the danger of death. But if there was no priest available, and there was no layman available, and there was no Muslim available, a woman would do. Clearly. A mere woman could baptize somebody. A mere woman could baptize. And you had a variety of materials with which to baptize. The ideal was some kind of running water. But if you didn't have running water, you could use cold water. You know, and if the person was a kind of a wimp, you could warm it up a little bit and baptize them with warm water. And if you were really, really stuck and there was no water available whatsoever, you could even use milk. So you could have baptized them with milk in kind of extremis. But there was a very dire warning. Be very, very careful about baptizing somebody. Because there's a special place, a special part of hell for baptized Catholics who die in mortal sin. So Genghis Khan will go to hell probably, but Genghis Khan is not going to be as badly off as a baptized Catholic who died with mortal sin on their souls. So be very, very careful. Don't just baptize anybody, who asked for baptism. Establish that they're not going to become Catholics who are going to commit mortal sins and die in mortal sin, because then they're going really down into the pits. So occasionally I'll break out that book and look at it. So I hope we've come some way from then. So hopefully in some parts of the Christian world. So today is the baptism of Jesus. And I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to regale you with a few baptismal stories. And then I'm going to talk about the baptism of John the Baptist, what that meant. And then the baptism of Jesus. And then fourthly, I'm going to talk about my own particular ideas about baptism. So a few stories around baptism. Between 1972 and 1979, I was living in a little mission in Kenya, a place called Kipchimchim. Literally means the place of the twins. And it was in a fairly bushy area with a lot of outstations, very, very remote outstations. And I had an old Volkswagen Bug at the time. And very, very often, we had a little maternity hospital on the compound. So very frequently, I'd get calls to go to a woman who was in distress, who was in a protracted labour, to bring her in to the hospital for the birthing process. So this one day, this man comes in, in a lather of sweat. He'd run about 15 miles to say that His wife had been in labour for 48 hours, and would I ever go, and bring her to the hospital? So we drive out to the bush in the Volkswagen. We get to the tiny little village, and there's a group of women standing around, and I see the baby, and it's obvious the baby has been born at this stage, just born, and it's obvious that the baby is dead. So they want me to baptize the baby. But as typical in this area, the nearest river is like a 40 minutes walk away, and there's no water in the house. And so I employed a sacrament from the Kalenjin people. Among the Kalenjin people, that tribe were Kalenjin people, spittle was a blessing. When you live on the equator, they would go out every single morning and spit on their hands and offer their hands to the sun because it was so warm. You're living on the edge of the desert. If you have spittle in your mouth, it means you're alive. So actually spittle and spitting on somebody was a form of blessing. It wasn't a curse, or it wasn't, that you were mad with somebody. If you spat on a little child, an old man would spit on a child to bless the child. And so I did the only thing I could. I took the little baby in my arms, and I spat on the baby 3 times. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So that was the baptism in Kipchimchim, 1972 and 1973. And I go back a few years, way back into the 1930s. My father was the eldest of 9 kids. And one of his brothers was Michael. My uncle Michael. And at that stage in 1930s, they would rush the baby to baptism the day after or 2 days after the child was born, in case the child would die before being baptized and be ushered off to limbo. So very, very frequently, the mother could not attend the baptism because she was still really, really sore and really hurting. So very frequently, the mother would not even be able to attend the baptism of the child. So that Michael's baptism is proceeding in this big, big, big empty cold cathedral in Cork City, and he's screaming his head off. And his godfather at the time was an uncle of his, and he's wondering, what am I going to do? Who's going to pacify this child? The mother's not present. So, being very, very inventive, he reached into his back pocket and he had a bottle of Paddy. Paddy is an Irish whiskey. Literally, it's called Paddy whiskey. And it comes in 2 sizes. There's a big container on this side, and there was one that was called a baby Paddy. And a baby Paddy is a tiny little bottle. So he took a baby Paddy out of his back, opened the top of it, stuck his pinky into it, doused it a few times, and stuck it into Michael's mouth. And Michael sucked away, and there wasn't a peep out of him for the rest of the ceremony. And it was the beginning of a lifelong love between Michael and Paddy. I lived at one stage very near a tiny little crossroads, and the name of the crossroads was Killeen. And when I got old enough to understand, Killeen in Gaelic means the little graveyard. And I found out the history behind it. During the Great Famine in Ireland between 1845 and 1847, the population of Ireland went from 8 million people down to 4 million through death and through emigration. So every morning, a cart would go around the village, and they'd pick up all the dead bodies who had died during the night, and they'd go and bury them in mass graves, just tumble them into the grave, and put a sprinkling of clay on top of them. And then in the afternoon, they'd go around for the second time, and anybody who died during the day, they'd put those in the cart, and they'd bring them out to the graveyard and tumble them on top of the other bodies and put a few more inches of clay. And then over the course of a few weeks, they'd fill up this mass grave. But little babies, and there were a lot of babies, obviously, who died in birth during that period of time, they couldn't be put even in those mass graves because they weren't baptized. So even a mass grave couldn't contain an unbaptized baby. So there were special graveyards, and they were called Killeen, little graveyards, where the unbaptized babies during the famine were buried. And this was one of them. So this was the compassionate, church of followers of Jesus Christ, that a little baby dying in famine times who couldn't be baptized, couldn't even be thrown into a pit with the parents who died. They'd have to go into a separate pit on their own. Irish nurses, when I was a child growing up, were educated that if they were taking part, a midwife, watching a very, very different labour, that they would use turkey basters, and I kid you not, that as soon as the baby crowned, they would baptize the baby with a turkey baster in case the child died in the birth process and would go down to limbo. And one of the grossest ones I know about baptism was a story that happened actually in Italy. There was a little boy born in 1851 in Bologna, which was a papal state. The papacy owned a whole bunch of Italy at that stage. So they owned the state of Bologna. And this little child is born into a Jewish family. And he's one of 8 kids. And as a small little child, he gets very seriously ill. And the family had a servant girl who was Catholic. and she secretly baptized the baby without telling the Jewish parents. The child recovered, and at the age 6, somehow, this girl confessed to the local parish priest that she'd baptized this baby. And the parish priest informed the Vatican, and the Vatican abducted the child. Because it was a rule in the Vatican States that a non-Catholic family could not raise a Catholic child. So they sent police to the parents, and they abducted the child. The parents came screaming. They came to the Vatican. They had a meeting with, the Pope at the time was Pius IX. And they had a meeting with Pius IX, please give us back our child. He said, you can have your child back if you convert to Catholicism. They refused to convert. So the child never went back. There was a delegation of Jewish leaders came to him. The President of the United States appealed to him. And he told everybody, I care not a whit what the world thinks. So the child was raised as a Catholic, partly in the Vatican chambers. Pius IX took a personal interest in him. And his name was Edgardo Montara. And he was ordained a Catholic priest at the age of 23. And his mission was to visit the cities of Europe to convert the Jews to Roman Catholicism. He died at the age of 80 in Belgium. And if he had lived a few more months, the interesting thing is he would have been captured by the Nazis and killed as a Jew. He died before that happened. So, and this is the great Pope who gave us infallibility. Pius IX was the one who decided he was infallible. So there's just a few baptismal stories. I want to transition then and talk about John's baptism that we hear about in today's story. You know, what is the baptism of John? To understand John's baptism, you have to understand a little bit about revivalism. In this country, in the United States, approximately every 50 years in American history, since independence in 1776, about every 50 years on average, there's a huge religious revival happens in the country, pretty predictably. Now, John, in some senses, was a kind of a revivalist within Judaism. Judaism of his time had gone, into kind of animal sacrifice, and groups of people felt that the priesthood was corrupted and the temple had been contaminated. So there was a whole spiritual movement within Judaism called the Essene community, living in Qumran, who believed that the temple had been corrupted and the priesthood was corrupted. And so these were people who lived in the desert, living according to the scriptures, they felt, in a much better way. Now, John the Baptist may very well have been an Essene. And so John had a real issue with normative Judaism of his time. He was trying to lead, in effect, some kind of revival movement. Now, John would have known better than most what the corruption might have looked like, because John's father was actually a priest, Zechariah. We meet him in chapter 1 of Luke's Gospel. And so John would have known from the inside exactly what the story was with the priesthood of the time and the temple of the time. So he's taking issue with this. So you found in one of the readings we heard today, he calls them broods of vipers. Who has taught you to flee from the retribution which is to come? So in some senses, John is the ultimate revivalist, using the kind of language that Lawrence spoke of. But it's very interesting, he used baptism as the kind of the symbol of transformation. And he did it in the Jordan River, and that's hugely symbolic. In the year 1210 BC, when the Israelites newly escaped out of slavery in Egypt, they'd been slaves in Egypt for 430 years, and in the year 1250, they're liberated by Moses. But they spent 40 years wandering in the desert. And then in the year 1210, they actually crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land. And they begin their conquest of the Promised Land at Jericho, at the Jordan. But it takes them 200 years before they actually capture the whole country. Jerusalem only fell in the year 1010 BC. So it takes them 200 years to make the conquest. So John is using this very symbolically as a new conquest of the land. But it's not a military conquest. It's not colonialism of any kind. It's a spiritual transformation. And baptism is going to be the symbol of that new kind of conquest, the conquest of people's spirits and souls, not of the country or not of the political process. So this is what John had in mind when he's denouncing the religion and the temple and the priesthood of his time and ushering in a new kind of a conquest. So that, for me, is what John's baptism represents. You look then at the baptism of Jesus. And it's interesting to me that John is baptized by Jesus, but Jesus never baptized anybody. You read in the Gospels that the disciples of Jesus baptized, but Jesus himself did not baptize. So his disciples did, but Jesus did not, for some reason. And the reason, I believe, is this. that Jesus took this same symbolism of John and he reversed it. So the conquest of the land of Canaan had begun in Jericho at the Jordan, and it ended up in Jerusalem 200 years later. And the impression you're given is that the land they invaded was a land, peopled by barbarians, the Canaanites. The proper name for the Canaanites was the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians were an extraordinarily sophisticated society, an extraordinarily developed civilization. It was the Phoenicians who invented the alphabet. Before the Phoenicians, we were working with hieroglyphics. We had to manipulate thousands of symbols in order to express language in a written format. The Phoenicians reduced all of that down to 22 symbols, which was then borrowed by the Greeks, and then borrowed by the Romans, and then borrowed by the Hebrews. So the Phoenicians invented the alphabet that we use today. We added a few letters to it, but it was the Phoenicians who produced it. They were extraordinary seafaring people. They had circumnavigated Africa in their great, great, great ships. And in actual fact, when it came to building the first temple in Jerusalem, which Solomon began about the year 950 BC, it was a Phoenician architect and Phoenician supervisors who looked after the building of the first temple. So the impression that you get very, very often in the Old Testament that they invaded a land peopled by barbarians is radically untrue. These were very, very sophisticated civilization. So now you look at Jesus and his idea of baptism. And I'm going to take you to a very strange place, because Jesus' most important teaching about baptism, in my opinion, is the story of the Good Samaritan. And he starts off by saying, a certain man went from Jerusalem to Jericho. So you see what's happening here? It's the opposite of the conquest. The conquest begins in Jericho and ends in Jerusalem. The story of the Good Samaritan begins in Jerusalem and ends in Jericho. And you all know the story. He says a certain man was going down, a Jewish man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was mugged, set upon by a bunch of robbers who beat him up, took everything he had, and left him half dead. And a few hours later, one of the priests from the temple was going down and sees this fellow Jew lying at the side of the road, beaten up, and just ignores him and keeps going. A few hours later, a Levite was going down. The Levites were the temple police. The Levite is going down. He sees a Jewish man at the side of the road, beaten up and dying, ignores him and keeps going. And some hours later, a Samaritan is going down. Now, the Samaritans are deadly enemies of the Jews at this stage. The Samaritan is going down, sees this Jewish man, has compassion for him, looks after him, puts him up on his own donkey, takes him down to Jericho, checks into a hotel, looks after him for several days, and then says to the innkeeper, I've got business to attend to, I'll be away for a few days. I want you to look after this guy, and I'll pick up the tab when I come back. At the end of that story, Jesus asked him, who then was a neighbor to the man who fell among thieves and robbers? And obviously, it wasn't the priest, it wasn't the Levite, it was this. So for me, that is Jesus' teaching on baptism, that it's a conquest of the soul. It's that instead of turning, the stranger into an enemy, you turn the enemy into a brother or a sister. That's what baptism is ultimately about. So when I see Jesus teaching about baptism, the reason he wasn't pouring water over anybody's heads is that he was baptizing them in his teaching. It was an oral baptism, an oral transmission of baptism. Which brings me to my fourth point. I want to talk then about some ideas of my own in baptism. So there's a tribe of people that lives in West Africa. And when a woman is pregnant and she's about 8 months pregnant, the elders will sequester her. They will take her into a hut and they will put her into a trance. And they will speak to the baby in utero. And they believe that the baby will use the mother's voice in order to respond. And they'll ask the child 2 questions. They'll ask the child, what is your name? And what is your purpose? What is your mission? What are you coming to do on this planet? And when the child is actually being born, the women will dance around the midwife and they'll keep chanting the name of the child, reminding the child of who he is and reminding the child of why he's come, his mission. Now that's a beautiful, beautiful baptismal ceremony. That's the realization that every single one of us is on safari. We're on a mission. We've come from God to perform some kind of a mission. So my belief system is that the sacrament of baptism, where a priest, a celebrate male priest, takes water and pours it over a neonate's head, that's not the baptism ceremony. That's just kind of a welcoming ceremony on behalf of the community. Every child is baptized in the waters of the womb. It is the mother who baptizes the child. Every single child is baptized in utero by the waters of the womb. So before you ever come out, you've already been baptized. The other thing is just a kind of a formality. It's the difference between going to college, getting an education, passing all your exams on one hand, and just going to the graduation ceremony on the other hand. It's not the graduation ceremony that kind of gives you the knowledge and the wisdom that you've acquired during the college career. It's the study. That's what it is. It's the period in the womb and the baptism by the mother's waters that baptizes the child. The other thing is just a welcoming ceremony on behalf of the child. And secondly, I believe that the vaginal juices that the baby experiences during the birthing process doesn't just confer, power on the immune system and defend it against allergens of various kinds. It is actually the vaginal juices of the birthing process are the chrism of ordination, because you get born, you get chrismed by your mother on the way out, and you're made a priest. Every single one of us is a priest. And the function of a priest, it is to transform the ordinary into the sacramental. When you live as a priest, when you understand your priesthood, everything you touch and everything you do can become a sacrament. The duty of priesthood is not going to stand at altars, and kind of hear confessions and, pour water over babies' heads and stuff like that. That's fine. That's a community need. But the real priesthood that every single one of us has is the priesthood of turning all life experiences into sacraments. It's the ability to encounter the secular and transform it into the sacred. It's the ability to encounter the mundane and transform it into the mystical. And so the real meaning of baptism for me is that every single one of us has been baptized by our mothers, and every single one of us has been ordained by the birthing process ourselves. So if Jesus is teaching us anything today in the story of his baptism, it is how to be priests for our world in our times.